I thanked my grandfather for the $240 check. He stopped carving. The turkey looked me straight in the eye and said, "The gift I wired you was $500,000. The entire dining room fell silent. Aunt Patricia dropped her wine glass red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth. Cousin Jake choked on his stuffing, coughing violently. Uncle Robert's face turned crimson with shock and anger. My hands trembled as I stared at Grandpa Harold, wondering if I had misheard him completely. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds before Uncle Robert's chair scraped against the hardwood floor as he shot to his feet. His napkin fell to the ground, forgotten, as he pointed an accusatory finger at my grandfather. $500,000! Robert's voice cracked with disbelief and rage. "Dad, what the hell are you thinking? Have you lost your mind?" Aunt Patricia scrambled to clean up the spilled wine, but her movements were frantic and unfocused. She kept glancing between Robert and Harold, her eyes wide with something that looked like panic. "Harold, surely you misspoke," she said, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a nervous bark. "You meant 2,400, right?" I sat frozen in my chair, still processing what I'd heard. My student loan payment was supposed to be $240 this month, and I'd been grateful that Grandpa Harold had offered to help. I was working 2 part-time jobs while finishing my engineering degree, and every dollar mattered. But $500,000. That had to be a mistake. "I meant exactly what I said," Harold replied calmly, continuing to slice the turkey with steady hands. $500,000. I transferred it to Kelvin's account yesterday morning. Jake finally stopped coughing and stared at me with undisguised envy. "That's not fair. What about the rest of us? I've been asking you for help with my car payments for months." "And what about my children?" Patricia shrieked, abandoning the wine cleanup entirely. "Emma and David deserve just as much consideration as Kelvin. This is completely unfair." Robert began pacing behind his chair, his face growing redder by the minute. "This is exactly what I was worried about. Dad, you're clearly not thinking straight anymore. First you forget where you put your glasses, then you can't remember what day it is, and now you're throwing away our family's money." "Robert, sit down," Harold said quietly, but there was steel in his voice that I'd rarely heard before. "I will not sit down!" Robert exploded. "Do you have any idea what $500,000 means to this family? That's money that should be saved for medical expenses, or distributed equally among all your grandchildren, or kept in trust for emergencies." I found my voice, finally. "Grandpa, I think there might be some confusion. I only asked for help with my student loan payment, $240. Maybe there was a banking error." Harold set down the carving knife and looked directly at me. His blue eyes were clear and focused, not at all confused like Robert kept insisting. "Kelvin, there was no error. I've been planning this for quite some time. You completed your engineering degree with honors, you've been working multiple jobs to support yourself, and you've never once asked for more than you absolutely needed. This is your reward for your character and determination." Character and determination. Jake scoffed. "What about my character? I've been helping you with yard work every weekend." "You've been coming over every weekend to ask for money," Harold replied evenly. "There's a difference." Patricia's voice rose to nearly a shriek. "This is favoritism, plain and simple, Harold. You promised me years ago that you would treat all the grandchildren equally. You said education funds would be distributed fairly." "I said I would help with education," Harold corrected. "Kelvin used his education funding 4 years ago for his first 2 years of college. He's been supporting himself since then through his own efforts. This is something different entirely." Robert stopped pacing and leaned across the table toward Harold. "Something different, Dad?" "This sounds exactly like the kind of impulsive decision-making that we need to be concerned about. You've been showing signs of confusion for months now. Last week you couldn't remember our conversation about Thanksgiving dinner arrangements. You've been forgetting appointments, misplacing important documents." "I haven't forgotten anything important," Harold said firmly. Then explain to me. Robert demanded how giving away $500,000 to one grandchild makes any logical sense whatsoever. The tension in the room was suffocating. I could smell the turkey getting cold, could see the mashed potatoes forming a skin on top, could hear the clock on the mantel ticking away seconds that felt like hours. My family was imploding right before my eyes, and it was apparently all because of money that I'd never asked for and wasn't sure I wanted. Uncle Robert, I said carefully, maybe we should all just take a step back and… Don't you dare try to mediate this, Patricia snapped at me. You've clearly manipulated Harold into this decision somehow. There's no way he came up with this on his own. I have not manipulated anyone, I said, my own temper starting to flare. I asked for help with a $240 student loan payment. That's it. I had no idea about any of this. Oh, please, Jake muttered. You've always been Grandpa's favorite. Coming over here with your engineering homework talking about your grades making the rest of us look bad. Making you look bad. I stood up, now my chair scraping against the floor just as Robert's had. Jake, you dropped out of community college after one semester and you've been asking Grandpa for money to fix your car for 3 years. The same car that you keep crashing because you won't stop texting while driving. Boys enough, Harold said, but his voice was lost in the growing chaos. Robert slammed his hand down on the table, making all the dishes jump. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Dad. You're pitting us against each other with this ridiculous decision. You're showing clear signs of impaired judgment, and I think it's time we had a serious conversation about your mental state. The words hung in the air like a threat. Patricia nodded vigorously, and even Jake looked somewhat uncomfortable with how quickly this had escalated to questioning Harold's mental capacity. Harold stood slowly, his full height still impressive, despite his 78 years. Are you suggesting that I'm mentally incompetent, Robert? I'm suggesting that giving away $500,000 without discussing it with family first suggests some confusion about appropriate decision-making. Robert said, trying to sound more reasonable now. I see. Harold wiped his hands on his napkin and looked around the table at each of us. Well, this has been quite illuminating. Kelvin, would you mind staying after dinner? I'd like to speak with you privately. Dad. Robert said, his voice taking on a warning tone. I really think any major financial decisions should involve the whole family at this point. The money is mine to give as I see fit, Harold replied coldly. And I see fit to give it to Kelvin. If anyone has a legal objection to that, you're welcome to contact an attorney. Patricia gasped. Harold, are you threatening us with lawyers now? I'm stating a fact, Harold said. The money is transferred, the decision is made, and this conversation is over. Like hell it's over, Robert muttered, but Harold had already turned and walked towards the kitchen, effectively ending the discussion. I looked around the table at the wreckage of what was supposed to be a pleasant family Thanksgiving. Patricia was glaring at me like I'd personally robbed her children. Jake was calculating something on his fingers, probably trying to figure out what his share of $500,000 should have been. Robert was staring at the doorway where Harold had disappeared, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. This isn't finished, Robert said quietly, looking directly at me. Not by a long shot. The promise in his voice sent a chill down my spine, and I suddenly realized that Harold's generous gift might have just started something that would tear our family apart forever. The next morning I drove to Harold's house, just as the sun was coming up over the oak trees in his front yard. My stomach had been churning all night, replaying every angry word and accusation from dinner. I'd barely slept, and when I did manage to doze off, I dreamed about family members fighting over piles of money, while Harold watched sadly from the corner. Harold answered the door in his old flannel robe and slippers, looking more frail than I'd noticed the day before. His white hair was uncombed, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he'd slept even less than I had. Come in, Kelvin, he said, stepping aside to let me into the familiar warmth of his living room. I've got coffee brewing and eggs ready to scramble. I figured we both needed a quiet breakfast after yesterday's excitement. The kitchen smelled like bacon, and coffee normal morning scents that seemed surreal after the chaos of Thanksgiving dinner. Harold moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, cracking eggs into a bowl and whisking them with the same steady hands that had carved the turkey before everything went wrong. "Aight, Grandpa." I started settling into the kitchen chair where I'd sat for countless childhood breakfasts. I need to understand what's really going on here. Yesterday felt like stepping into someone else's family. Harold poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs, one of them a Father's Day gift I'd made him in elementary school pottery class. "Kelvin, what I'm about to tell you needs to stay between us, at least for now. Can you promise me that—" The seriousness in his voice made me sit up straighter. "Of course." Harold sat down across from me and reached into the pocket of his robe, pulling out a manila envelope that looked thick with documents. "I'm dying, son." The words hit me like a physical blow. Coffee sloshed over the rim of my mug as my hands shook involuntarily. "What do you mean you're dying? Everyone's dying eventually, but—" "I have pancreatic cancer," Harold said quietly, sliding the envelope across the table to me. "Stage 4, diagnosed 3 months ago. The doctors give me maybe 6 months, probably less." I opened the envelope with trembling fingers and found medical reports, lab results, and doctor's notes that confirmed everything he'd just said. The words swam on the page as I tried to process what I was reading. Malignant tumor, metastasis, palliative care, terminal diagnosis. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I whispered. "Because I wanted to see who my family really was before I died." Harold replied, getting up to tend to the eggs. "I've been watching Kelvin, watching and listening and learning some very uncomfortable truths about the people I thought I knew." He scraped eggs onto 2 plates and added bacon, his movements methodical despite the bombshell he'd just dropped. "Over the past few months, I've been playing a little dumber than I actually am, forgetting things, occasionally seeming confused about dates and appointments. Nothing dramatic, just enough to see how people would react to signs of mental decline. The confusion Robert was talking about yesterday. I realized—" "Exactly." Harold sat back down and pushed a plate toward me. And what I discovered was that Robert has been treating those moments not with concern or compassion, but with opportunity. I forced myself to take a bite of eggs, though my appetite had completely vanished. "What kind of opportunity?" Harold pulled out another folder from somewhere behind him, this one filled with bank statements and financial documents. "Your Uncle Robert has been stealing from me, Kelvin, systematically, for at least 3 years, probably longer." The bacon turned to cardboard in my mouth. "Stealing how?" "Small amounts at first. A few $100s here and there from my checking account. Then larger amounts from the trust fund I set up for family emergencies. He's been forging my signature on withdrawal slips, creating fake invoices for home repairs that never happened, even billing me for medical care that I never received." Harold spread the documents across the table, pointing out discrepancies with a pen. "Look at this. $800 for landscaping services in March. I do my own yard work and always have. $1,200 for roof repairs in June. My roof is fine. $2,000 for medication assistance in September. My insurance covers all my prescriptions." I studied the papers, my engineering background making it easy to spot the patterns Harold was showing me. "This adds up to over $200,000, Harold finished grimly. "And that's just what I've been able to track down so far. There might be more." The kitchen suddenly felt cold, despite the warm morning sun streaming through the windows. "But why Uncle Robert has a good job at the insurance company? He and Patricia live in that nice house in Riverside." "The nice house they couldn't actually afford," Harold said. "The nice cars they bought on credit. The vacation to Europe last summer that Patricia kept posting about on social media. It's all been funded by money stolen from me." I pushed my plate away, unable to eat another bite. "And Patricia knows about this?" "Oh, she's been helping. Look at these signature samples." Harold showed me withdrawal slips with his name signed in slightly different handwriting. This one's Robert's forgery, and this one's Patricia's. They've been taking turns. The betrayal felt personal, even though it wasn't my money being stolen. These were people I'd grown up loving and trusting, people who'd taught me to ride bikes, and helped with homework, and attended my school plays. What about Jake? I'm not sure how much he knows, Harold admitted. But he's been asking me for money more frequently lately, and some of his requests coincided with larger withdrawals from my accounts. I suspect his parents have been using him to test how much I might be willing to give away voluntarily. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Harold's neat backyard where I'd played as a child. The swing set was still there, older and rustier now, but still holding memories of simpler times, when family meant safety and love instead of greed and deception. Why didn't you call the police? I asked, without turning around. Because I want ironclad proof before I act, Harold said. And because I want to give them one last chance to do the right thing. But mostly because I need someone I can trust to help me, and you're the only family member who's never asked me for anything you didn't genuinely need. I turned back to face him. The $500,000 is real, and it's yours, Harold confirmed. I sold some property I owned, downtown land that's been in the family for decades. I'd been planning to leave it to Robert and Patricia in my will, but obviously that's no longer appropriate. Grandpa, I can't accept that much money while you're dealing with all this. Harold smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. It's not charity, Kelvin. It's payment for a job I need you to do. I want you to help me catch them in the act and make sure they face consequences for what they've done. But more than that, I want you to help me protect whatever's left of our family from their greed. I sat back down, my mind racing. What exactly are you asking me to do? Use that engineering brain of yours to help me gather evidence. Document everything they've stolen, build a case that will hold up in court, and help me figure out how to stop them from taking anything else. Harold reached across the table and gripped my hand with surprising strength. I know it's a lot to ask, especially when you should be focusing on starting your career. But Kelvin, you're the only person I trust completely. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat. Yesterday, I'd been a struggling college graduate working part-time jobs and worrying about student loans. Today, I was apparently the only thing standing between my grandfather and the family members who were systematically robbing him blind. How long have you been planning this? I asked. Since the day I got my diagnosis, Harold replied. I realized I had a choice. I could spend my remaining months pretending everything was fine, while Robert and Patricia stole me blind, or I could use whatever time I have left to protect the legacy I want to leave behind and make sure justice gets done. I looked at my grandfather, really looked at him, and saw not a frail old man, but a strategist. Someone who'd spent decades building a successful business and accumulating wealth through hard work and careful planning. Someone who wasn't going to let thieves destroy everything he'd built, even if those thieves were his own family. What's our first step? I asked. Harold's smile grew wider, and for a moment he looked 20 years younger. Now you sound like the grandson I raised. Our first step is to document everything we can find. Then we wait for them to make their next move. Because based on Robert's reaction yesterday, I guarantee they're not going to let this go quietly. He was right, of course. Uncle Robert had made it clear that this wasn't over. And as I looked at the evidence spread across Harold's kitchen table, I realized that what had started as a simple Thanksgiving dinner had turned into something much larger and more dangerous. I was about to go to war with my own family, and I wasn't sure any of us would survive it intact. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone I'd never been before, a detective. Harold had given me a key to his house and access to all his financial records, and I attacked the investigation with the same methodical approach I'd learned in engineering school. Every morning before my shift at the electronics store, I'd spend 2 hours at Harold's kitchen table creating spreadsheets and tracking patterns that revealed the true scope of Robert and Patricia's theft. What I discovered was far worse than Harold had initially suspected. Using my laptop and Harold's permission to access his online banking, I traced fraudulent transactions going back almost 4 years. Robert had started small testing whether Harold would notice $50 withdrawals here and there. When those went undetected, the amounts grew larger and more frequent. By year 2, they were taking thousands per month. But the real shock came when I visited Harold's bank to speak with his longtime banker, Mrs. Thompson. She was a woman in her 60s with graying hair and kind eyes, who'd known Harold since before I was born. When I explained that I was helping Harold review his accounts for discrepancies, her expression immediately grew troubled. "Oh, Kelvin, I'm so glad Harold is finally looking into this," she said, lowering her voice and glancing around the busy bank lobby. "I've been worried about some of the activity on his accounts for months now." She led me into a private office and pulled up Harold's account history on her computer screen. "Your Uncle Robert has been coming in here regularly, usually with withdrawal slips and requests for cashier's checks. At first, everything seemed normal. Harold had added him as an authorized user years ago for emergencies. But then things changed," I prompted. The frequency increased dramatically, and the explanation started sounding rehearsed. Mrs. Thompson explained. Robert would come in with these elaborate stories about Harold needing money for medical expenses or home repairs. But when I'd call Harold to confirm, he'd sound confused about what Robert was referring to. She showed me transaction logs that made my stomach turn. Robert had been coming to the bank every 2 weeks, like clockwork, withdrawing amounts between $800 and $3,000 each time. The patterns were so regular they looked like automatic payments. "Why didn't you flag this as suspicious?" I asked. "I tried," Mrs. Thompson said sadly. "I called Harold several times to verify large withdrawals, but Robert always seemed to have explanations ready. And honestly, elderly account holders sometimes forget about authorizing transactions, so I gave them the benefit of the doubt longer than I should have." She pulled up a folder of photocopied documents. "But I did start keeping copies of everything just in case. Look at this." The signatures on the withdrawal slips were clearly different when viewed side by side. Harold's real signature was steady and precise, refined by decades of signing business documents. The forged signatures were shakier, less confident, and showed subtle differences in letter formation that became obvious once you knew what to look for. "There's something else," Mrs. Thompson added hesitantly. "Last week, Robert came in asking about procedures for having someone declared mentally incompetent for financial purposes. He claimed Harold was showing signs of dementia, and the family was concerned about his ability to manage money." My blood ran cold. "What did you tell him?" "I gave him the standard information packet about financial guardianship procedures," she replied. "But Kelvin, I've talked to Harold dozens of times over the past few months, and he's always seemed perfectly sharp to me, more aware of his account activity than most customers half his age." I spent another hour with Mrs. Thompson photocopying documents and building a timeline of suspicious activity. By the time I left the bank, I had evidence of systematic theft that went far beyond what Harold had discovered on his own. That afternoon, I drove to Harold's house and spread everything out on his dining room table. Bank statements, withdrawal slips, forged signatures, and my own analytical breakdown showing patterns that would be impossible to explain away as innocent mistakes. "It's worse than we thought," I told Harold as he examined my findings. "They've stolen closer to $300,000, and they're planning to have you declared incompetent so they can steal the rest." Harold studied the evidence with the calm focus of someone who'd suspected exactly this outcome. "How long do you think we have before they make their move?" "Based on Robert's behavior at Thanksgiving and his visit to the bank, I'd guess they're planning to act soon," I replied. "Mrs. Thompson said he asked about competency procedures last week. If they're serious about that route, they'll probably try to file paperwork within the next few weeks." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Then we need to move faster than they do." I spent the rest of that week gathering evidence with an urgency that surprised me. Every free moment between work shifts was devoted to building an unshakable case. I photographed documents, created detailed spreadsheets, and even drove past Robert and Patricia's house to document their clearly expensive lifestyle. Their house in Riverside was a sprawling ranch-style home with professional landscaping and a 3-car garage housing 2 luxury vehicles and Robert's boat. The property taxes alone, which I looked up through public records, would have been a stretch on Robert's insurance company salary. But with an extra $300,000 in stolen money, it all made perfect sense. On Friday evening, as I was organizing the latest batch of evidence at Harold's house, my phone buzzed with a text message from Jake. "Hey cousin, want to grab a beer tomorrow? Need to talk about the family situation." I showed the message to Harold, who frowned thoughtfully. "That's interesting timing. You think his parents sent him?" "I think Jake is probably being used to gather information about our reaction to Thanksgiving," Harold replied. "But this might be an opportunity to learn more about their plans." I agreed to meet Jake at Murphy's Bar, a sports pub near the community college, where we'd sometimes hung out before he dropped out. I wasn't looking forward to lying to him, but I needed to know what Robert and Patricia were planning. Saturday evening, I found Jake already seated at a corner table, nursing a beer and staring at the basketball game on the wall-mounted television. He looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his phone and glancing toward the door every few minutes. "Thanks for coming out," he said as I sat down and ordered a beer. "I know things got pretty heated at Thanksgiving." "That's one way to put it," I replied carefully. Jake was quiet for several minutes, and I could see him working up to whatever he'd been sent to say. Finally, he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Look, Kelvin, my parents are really worried about Grandpa Harold. Worried how they think he's losing it mentally," Jake said, avoiding my eyes. "The thing with the $500,000 forgetting about conversations, not keeping track of his finances. They think he needs help managing his affairs before he makes any more impulsive decisions." I took a slow sip of my beer, choosing my words carefully. "Harold seems pretty sharp to me. We talked for a long time yesterday, and he remembered details about conversations we had years ago." "But he gave you $500,000 without talking to anyone first," Jake pressed. "That's not normal behavior for someone his age." "Maybe he had his reasons," I replied. Jake shifted uncomfortably. "My dad thinks Harold might be getting taken advantage of by someone who's influencing his financial decisions for their own benefit." The implication was clear. Robert was already building a narrative where I was the villain manipulating Harold for money. It was probably the same story he planned to tell lawyers and judges if he moved forward with competency proceedings. "What do you think, Jake?" I asked directly. "I think—" Jake hesitated, then seemed to deflate. "I think my parents are really stressed about money right now, and seeing you get that much from Grandpa Harold really freaked them out." It was the most honest thing Jake had said all evening, and I felt a flicker of sympathy for him. He was caught between his parents' greed and his own sense of right and wrong, probably not fully understanding how deep the corruption went. "Are they in financial trouble?" I asked gently. Jake nodded miserably. "Dad's been working overtime constantly, and Mom's been talking about getting a second job. They keep arguing about credit card bills and mortgage payments. When they heard about your money, I think they felt like they were being left out of something they deserved." I finished my beer and stood up. "Jake, can I give you some advice?" "Sure. Whatever your parents are planning to do about Harold and his money, make sure you're not part of it. Some things aren't worth destroying your relationship with your grandfather over." Jake looked up at me with confusion and something that might have been fear. "What do you mean, planning to do?" But I was already walking towards the door, having learned everything I needed to know. Robert and Patricia were moving forward with their plans to have Harold declared incompetent, and they were using Jake to test whether I might be willing to cooperate with their version of events. What they didn't know was that I had already chosen my side, and I was building a case that would destroy them before they could destroy Harold. The real war was just beginning. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning, when I decided to install a small security camera in Harold's kitchen. We'd agreed that we needed to document any suspicious behavior during family visits, and I'd bought a discreet wireless camera that could be hidden behind his coffee maker, I was setting up the camera while Harold was at his doctor's appointment when I heard a car pull into the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I saw Jake's beat-up Honda Civic, which struck me as odd, since Harold wasn't home. I quickly finished positioning the camera and activated its recording function on my phone, just as Jake used his key to enter through the back door. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to be there because he jumped when he saw me standing in the kitchen. "Oh, hey, Kelvin," he said, trying to sound casual, despite being obviously startled. "I was just stopping by to check on Grandpa Harold." "He's at the doctor," I replied, watching Jake's face carefully. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah, fine," Jake said. But he was acting nervous, glancing around the kitchen with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I was just going to make sure he had everything he needed. Check his medicine cabinet, see if he was running low on anything." Something about the way he said medicine cabinet sent warning bells through my head. "That's thoughtful of you. I'm sure he'd appreciate that." Jake nodded and headed toward the bathroom, and I quietly followed him down the hallway. Through the partially open door, I watched him open Harold's medicine cabinet and examine the prescription bottles inside. But instead of checking levels or expiration dates, Jake was reading labels and writing down information in a small notebook. When he pulled out his phone and took pictures of several prescription bottles, I knew I was witnessing something significant. I retreated to the kitchen before Jake finished, and when he emerged a few minutes later, he seemed more relaxed. "Looks like he's got plenty of everything," Jake announced. "I should probably head out before he gets back." After Jake left, I immediately called Harold and told him what I'd witnessed. Harold was quiet for a long moment before asking me to meet him at his house as soon as possible. "Bring your laptop," he said. "I want you to research every medication Jake photographed." 90 minutes later, I was sitting at Harold's kitchen table with my laptop looking up information about the prescription medications Jake had been so interested in. Harold sat beside me, providing details about what each medication was prescribed for. "This one is for blood pressure," Harold said, pointing to one of the names I'd written down. "This is a mild sleep aid for occasional insomnia. And this one—" Harold paused, his face growing serious. "This one was discontinued months ago. I stopped taking it when my doctor switched me to a different medication for my arthritis pain." I looked up from my laptop screen. "But the bottle was still in your medicine cabinet." "It was nearly empty, but yes. I keep old prescriptions until I'm sure the new ones are working properly." Harold frowned. Why would Jake be interested in discontinued medication? I spent the next hour researching the discontinued arthritis medication online, and what I found made my stomach turn. The medication contained ingredients that, when crushed and dissolved in liquid, could cause drowsiness, confusion, and short-term memory problems in elderly patients. "Sorry. Harold." "Tor," I said slowly, "I think Jake has been drugging you." Harold's face went pale. "What do you mean?" I turned my laptop screen toward him, showing articles about medication abuse and the effects of crushing time-release pills. These symptoms that Robert kept talking about at Thanksgiving. The confusion, the forgetfulness, the apparent mental decline. What if they weren't natural aging, but the result of someone slipping you crushed medication? Harold was quiet for a long time, thinking back over recent family visits. "Jake always insists on making my coffee when he comes over," he said finally. "Says it's his way of taking care of me." "And when did you start having episodes of confusion?" "About 6 months ago," Harold replied. "Always during or shortly after family visits." The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Robert and Patricia weren't just stealing Harold's money, they were actively working to make him appear mentally incompetent to justify their theft and pave the way for legal guardianship. "We need proof," I said. "The security camera will help, but we need more than that." Harold stood up and walked to his kitchen window, looking out at the yard where Jake had played as a child. "I never imagined they would do something like this," he said quietly. "Stealing money is one thing, but drugging an elderly family member—" "It's elder abuse," I finished, "and it's a serious felony." That evening, I called in sick to work and spent hours researching legal procedures for elder abuse cases. What I learned was both encouraging and terrifying. The evidence we were gathering would definitely support criminal charges, but we needed to be extremely careful about how we proceeded. If Robert and Patricia suspected we were onto them, they might accelerate their plans or destroy evidence. The next morning, Harold called Jake and invited him over for coffee, claiming he'd been feeling lonely and would appreciate the company. I positioned myself in Harold's bedroom with a clear view of the kitchen through the partially open door, my phone ready to record whatever happened. Jake arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, carrying a small paper bag that he claimed contained donuts from Harold's favorite bakery. He hugged Harold warmly and immediately moved toward the coffee maker, just as Harold had predicted. "Sit down, Grandpa," Jake said cheerfully. "Let me make coffee for us. You just relax." From my hiding spot, I watched Jake prepare 2 cups of coffee with practiced efficiency. But when he thought Harold wasn't looking, Jake pulled something from his pocket and sprinkled it into one of the cups before stirring vigorously. I managed to capture the entire sequence on video, including clear footage of Jake adding the unknown substance to Harold's coffee. Harold, who had been warned about what to expect, accepted his coffee cup, but didn't drink from it. Instead, he engaged Jake in conversation about family and school, asking questions that kept Jake talking while the coffee grew cold. After Jake left, promising to visit again soon, Harold and I carefully preserved the drugged coffee for laboratory testing. We now had video evidence of Jake adding something to Harold's drink, plus the physical evidence of the contaminated coffee itself. But as we sat in Harold's kitchen discussing our next steps, I realized we'd uncovered something even more sinister than simple theft. Robert and Patricia hadn't just been stealing money. They'd been systematically poisoning Harold to make him appear mentally incompetent, probably as preparation for having him declared legally unable to manage his own affairs. "They were going to have me committed to a nursing home," Harold said quietly, understanding the full scope of the plan. Once they had legal guardianship, they could control all my assets and sell my house. I would have disappeared into some facility, and no one would have questioned it because they'd have medical documentation of my mental decline. The coldness of it took my breath away. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about erasing Harold entirely, turning him into a helpless victim who could be controlled and exploited until he died. "What do we do now?" I asked. Harold looked at me with determination I hadn't seen since he was running his own business. "Now we turn the tables. If they want to play games with my mental state, let's give them a show they'll never forget." For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw Harold smile with genuine anticipation. Whatever he was planning, Robert and Patricia were about to discover that they'd seriously underestimated their target. And I was about to learn that my grandfather had a few strategic moves they never saw coming. Harold's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Over the next week, we carefully choreographed what he called the performance of a lifetime. If Robert and Patricia wanted Harold to appear mentally incompetent, we would give them exactly what they expected, but with a twist they would never see coming. First, I contacted Detective Morris, a longtime family friend who had known Harold for decades. Harold explained the situation and showed him our evidence, including the video of Jake drugging the coffee and the financial documents proving systematic theft. Detective Morris agreed to help us set up a legal sting operation that would capture ironclad confessions, while ensuring everything we gathered would be admissible in court. "What you're describing is elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy," Detective Morris explained as we sat in Harold's living room. "If we can get them to confess on record, we can put all 3 of them in prison for a very long time." The plan we developed was elegant and devastating. Harold would invite the entire family over for what he called an important family meeting about his health and finances. But instead of the confused, vulnerable old man, they expected to find they would discover a carefully orchestrated trap. I spent 2 days installing professional recording equipment throughout Harold's house, hidden cameras and microphones that would capture everything in high definition. Detective Morris helped me position the equipment to meet legal standards for evidence collection. Meanwhile, Harold practiced his confused elderly man performance with the dedication of a method actor. He watched YouTube videos about dementia symptoms, studied the behavior patterns of confusion and memory loss, and even consulted with a retired drama teacher from the local community college who helped him perfect the subtle details. The key Harold explained to me as he practiced forgetting my name for the third time is to make them feel comfortable enough to reveal their true plans. They need to believe I'm too far gone to understand what they're saying. On the appointed day, Robert, Patricia, and Jake arrived at Harold's house carrying folders and documents that immediately caught my attention. Patricia had a briefcase. Robert carried a manila envelope thick with papers, and Jake looked nervous in a way that suggested he knew more about today's agenda than he'd admitted. I greeted them at the door and led them into the living room where Harold was sitting in his favorite armchair staring blankly at a television that wasn't turned on. "Hi, Grandpa Harold," Jake said cautiously. "How are you feeling today?" Harold looked up with unfocused eyes and a confused expression that was absolutely perfect. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice sounding lost and vulnerable. Patricia and Robert exchanged glances, and I saw something cold and calculating in their expressions that made my skin crawl. "It's me, Dad," Robert said, speaking slowly and loudly, as if Harold were deaf rather than confused. "Robert, your son. We're here to talk about your situation." "My situation," Harold repeated, sounding genuinely bewildered. "Your health, your finances, your living arrangements," Patricia said, settling into the couch and opening her briefcase. "We're concerned about your ability to take care of yourself." Harold stared at her blankly, and I had to admire his acting skills. If I hadn't known this was a performance, I would have been genuinely worried about his mental state. "Dad," Robert said, leaning forward in his chair, "do you remember giving Kelvin $500,000 last month?" Harold's expression remained blank. "Kelvin." "Your grandson," Patricia prompted, pointing at me. "The one sitting right there." Harold looked at me with no recognition whatsoever. "I don't know him." The transformation in Robert and Patricia was immediate and chilling. Their concerned, caring facades dropped away, replaced by expressions of barely concealed excitement. Jake looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat, as if he wanted to be anywhere else. "This is worse than we thought," Robert announced, making notes on a legal pad. "Dad, who am I?" I'm not sure," Harold replied hesitantly. "What year is it?" Patricia asked. Harold guessed wrong by 5 years, and Robert wrote that down too. "Dad, where do you keep your important financial documents?" Robert asked, his voice taking on an urgent tone. "Important documents," Harold repeated. "Your will, your bank information, your investment accounts," Patricia clarified. "We need to know where everything is so we can help you." Harold pointed vaguely toward his bedroom. "There's a safe, I think, somewhere." Robert was practically vibrating with anticipation. "Do you remember the combination to the safe?" "No," Harold said simply. Patricia pulled out a thick folder from her briefcase and spread documents across the coffee table. "Harold, these are legal papers that will help us take care of you properly. We need you to sign them so we can manage your finances and make sure you get the medical care you need." I moved closer to look at the documents, and my heart nearly stopped. Power of attorney forms, guardianship papers, medical competency waivers, even a preliminary commitment form for a long-term care facility. They had come here planning to have Harold declared incompetent and committed to a nursing home today. "What do the papers say?" Harold asked, sounding genuinely confused. "They say that Robert will handle your money from now on," Patricia explained, speaking to Harold like he was a small child, "and that we'll find you a nice place to live where people can take care of you all the time." "Will I like this place?" Harold asked. "Oh, yes," Robert said, his voice dripping with false reassurance. "You'll love it. No more worrying about bills or finances or making difficult decisions. We'll take care of everything." Harold looked around the room with lost eyes. But this is my house. We'll sell the house, Patricia said matter-of-factly. You don't need it anymore, and the money from the sale will help pay for your care. Jake finally spoke up, his voice shaky. Maybe we should give him more time to think about this. Jake, your grandfather, is clearly not capable of making these kinds of decisions anymore. Robert snapped. Look at him. He doesn't even recognize his own family. We need to act quickly before he does something dangerous with his remaining money. Like giving away $500,000 to someone he doesn't even remember, Patricia added, glaring in my direction. Harold seemed to shrink into his chair. I gave someone money. A lot of money. Robert confirmed. Money that could have paid for your medical care or been saved for emergencies. That's exactly why we need to take control of your finances before you make any more mistakes. We've already found you a lovely facility, Patricia said, pulling out brochures for nursing homes. Sunset Manor has an excellent reputation for caring for people with your condition. My condition, Harold repeated. Dementia, Robert said bluntly. Severe cognitive decline. You're not safe living alone anymore, Dad. As I watched Robert and Patricia manipulate Harold into signing away his independence and his assets, I felt a rage building inside me that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. These people were monsters preying on what they thought was a helpless elderly man for their own financial gain. But they had no idea they were about to walk into the trap of their lives. I'm scared, Harold said in a small voice. I don't understand what's happening to me. Don't be scared, Patricia cooed, moving to sit beside him on the arm of his chair. We're family. We're going to take care of everything. Including the money you stole, I said quietly. The room went completely silent. Robert, Patricia, and Jake all turned to stare at me with expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. What did you say? Robert demanded. I said including the money you stole. I repeated, my voice steady and clear. The $300,000 you've been systematically stealing from Harold's accounts over the past 4 years. Patricia's face went white. That's a serious accusation, Kelvin. I think you should be very careful about what you're saying. Oh, I'm being very careful, I replied, standing up and walking to the mantelpiece where Detective Morris emerged from Harold's kitchen, his police badge clearly visible. Ladies and gentlemen, Detective Morris announced, you're all under arrest for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy. The chaos that followed was spectacular. Robert leaped to his feet, papers scattering everywhere. Patricia started shrieking about misunderstandings and false accusations. Jake just sat frozen, staring at Detective Morris with his mouth hanging open. But the best part was Harold, who suddenly straightened up in his chair, his confused expression replaced by sharp intelligence and satisfied smile. Surprise, Harold said calmly. I've been recording every word you said today. The look on Robert's face was worth every moment of planning we'd put into this operation. Pure shock followed by understanding, followed by absolute fury. You set us up? Robert snarled. I gave you exactly what you wanted, Harold replied. A confused, vulnerable old man with lots of money. The only problem is that I'm not nearly as confused as you thought. Detective Morris began reading them their rights, while Harold stood up and walked to his safe, his movements confident and purposeful. Patricia, you mentioned wanting to know the combination to my safe. It's the date I realized you and Robert were thieves. I'll never forget that day as long as I live. As the 3 criminals were led away in handcuffs, Harold turned to me with the brightest smile I'd seen from him in months. Kelvin, he said, I think this calls for a celebration. The aftermath of their arrests unfolded like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Detective Morris had captured everything on high-quality audio and video, creating an ironclad case that would have made any prosecutor weep with joy. Robert, Patricia, and Jake had confessed to years of systematic theft, elder abuse, and conspiracy, all while thinking their victim was too mentally impaired to understand what they were saying. But Robert wasn't going down without a fight. As Detective Morris processed the arrests in Harold's living room, Robert launched into a desperate counterattack that revealed just how prepared he'd been for this moment. This is all fabricated. Robert declared, his voice carrying the authority he'd built up over years in the insurance business. "Detective, you need to understand that my father has been manipulated by Kelvin here. Everything we did was legitimate financial assistance for an elderly man who clearly cannot manage his own affairs." Patricia, despite being handcuffed, nodded vigorously. "Harold has been showing signs of dementia for months. Ask anyone in the family, ask his neighbors, ask his doctor. We have documentation of his mental decline." Robert continued, his confidence growing as he built his defense. "Medical appointments missed, confusion about basic facts, inappropriate financial decisions like giving away $500,000 to someone he barely knows." Jake, looking terrified, jumped on his parents' strategy. "Yeah, and Kelvin has been coaching him. I've seen them together going over bank statements and documents. Kelvin has been influencing him to make accusations against us." Detective Morris looked between Robert and me with professional skepticism. "These are serious counter-allegations, Mr. Robert. Are you claiming that Kelvin has been manipulating your father, or—" "Absolutely," Robert replied without hesitation. "Look at the timeline. Harold starts showing mental confusion 6 months ago. Suddenly, Kelvin is spending all this time with him, and now Harold is accusing his own family of crimes. It's classic manipulation of a vulnerable elderly person." My stomach dropped as I realized how carefully Robert had planned for this possibility. Every piece of evidence we had could potentially be reinterpreted as proof of my manipulation rather than their guilt. But Harold wasn't finished with his surprises. "Robert," Harold said calmly, walking to his safe and entering the combination with steady fingers, "you've always been a thorough planner, but your biggest mistake was underestimating me." From the safe, Harold pulled out a thick folder that I'd never seen before. "Detective Morris, what Robert doesn't know is that I've been documenting suspicious financial activity for over 2 years, long before I ever told Kelvin about any of this." Harold opened the folder to reveal photographs, handwritten notes, and documentation that clearly predated my involvement by months. Every forged signature, every fake invoice, every suspicious withdrawal. I documented it all because I knew eventually I'd need proof. Detective Morris examined the materials, his expression growing more serious by the minute. "Mr. Harold, this appears to be a comprehensive investigation log. When did you start keeping these records?" 2 years and 3 months ago, Harold replied, precisely. "The day I realized that invoices for home repairs I'd never authorized were being paid from my checking account." Robert's face was turning red with frustrated anger. "Dad, those were legitimate expenses. You authorized those payments and then forgot about them because of your mental condition." "Really?" Harold pulled out a specific document from his folder. "Then explain this invoice for $8,000 in roof repairs dated last March. Detective Morris, would you like to inspect my roof? It hasn't been touched in over 10 years. Patricia tried a different approach. "Harold, you're confused about the timeline. You did ask us to help with your finances because you were having trouble keeping track of things." "I never asked for your help with finances," Harold replied firmly. "What I did was test your honesty by occasionally pretending to be more confused than I actually was, and you failed that test spectacularly." He turned to Jake with disappointment clear in his voice. "And you, Jake. I trusted you to make my coffee when you visited. I never imagined you were drugging me." Jake's face crumpled. "Grandpa, they told me it was just to help you sleep better. They said you were having trouble with anxiety, and the medication would help you relax. By crushing up pills and slipping them into my food without my knowledge." Harold's voice carried a weight of betrayal that silenced the entire room. Detective Morris held up the evidence bag containing the coffee sample we'd preserved. "Jake, we had this tested. It contains crushed medication that was never prescribed for your grandfather. That's assault, possibly attempted murder depending on the dosage." The fight went out of Jake immediately. "I didn't know it was that serious," he whispered. "My parents said it was just to help him calm down during family discussions." Robert realized his strategy was crumbling, and made one last desperate attempt. Detective, even if some of these financial transactions were irregular, the fundamental issue remains that my father is not mentally competent to manage $500,000. The money he gave to Kelvin proves that. Actually, Harold said with a smile that was equal parts satisfaction, and Steele, the money I gave to Kelvin proves exactly the opposite. He pulled out another document from his safe, this one bearing the letterhead of a law firm downtown. I consulted with attorney Margaret Sullivan before making any financial gifts. She evaluated my mental capacity according to legal standards and determined that I was fully competent to make decisions about my own assets. Detective Morris examined the legal document. This is a formal competency evaluation conducted by a licensed attorney. Mr. Harold, this states that you underwent comprehensive cognitive testing and were found to be of sound mind and capable of making informed financial decisions. The evaluation was conducted 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. Harold continued, I wanted legal protection against exactly the kind of accusations Robert is making now. Robert stared at his father with a mixture of fury and grudging admiration. You planned all of this. I planned to protect my assets and my independence from thieves, Harold replied. The fact that those thieves turned out to be my own family members is the only part of this situation that surprised me. As Detective Morris finished processing the evidence and preparing to transport the prisoners, Robert made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his scheme. Dad, regardless of what happens to us, you're still going to need help managing your affairs. You're 78 years old, and whether you admit it or not, you're not as sharp as you used to be. Harold looked at Robert with an expression I'd never seen before, a combination of sadness and finality that spoke to the death of any remaining paternal affection. Robert, I built a successful business from nothing, accumulated more wealth than you'll ever see legitimately, and just outsmarted 3 people half my age who thought they could steal my life savings and commit me to a nursing home. Exactly which part of that suggests I need your help with anything. As Robert, Patricia, and Jake were led away to the police cars waiting in Harold's driveway, I stood beside my grandfather and watched the destruction of what remained of our family's trust and unity. But instead of sadness, what I felt was overwhelming relief. The poison had been removed, the thieves had been caught, and Harold was finally safe from the people who should have been protecting him. Justice had been served, and for the first time in months, Harold looked truly at peace. 3 months after the arrests, I sat across from Harold at the same kitchen table where this entire journey had begun, sharing what had become our weekly breakfast tradition. The morning sun streamed through clean windows, and the house felt lighter somehow, as if the removal of Robert and Patricia's toxic presence had allowed warmth and honesty to return to these rooms. Harold looked better than he had in years. His color was good, his eyes were bright, and there was an energy about him that spoke to renewed purpose and genuine happiness. He was wearing his favorite flannel shirt and had just finished making what he claimed were the best pancakes in 3 counties. Kelvin, Harold said, setting down his coffee mug and pulling out a manila envelope that looked suspiciously official. I have something to show you. My stomach tightened involuntarily. After everything we'd been through, unexpected documents still made me nervous. Harold opened the envelope and slid a medical report across the table to me. I recognized the letterhead from his oncologist's office and prepared myself for whatever news it contained. But as I read the report, my confusion grew with every line. According to the latest test results, Harold's cancer was not just stable or improving, it was completely gone. No detectable tumors, normal blood work, and a prognosis that suggested he might live another 20 years. I don't understand, I said, looking up at Harold's quietly amused expression. 3 months ago, you told me you had 6 months to live. 3 months ago, I believed that was true, Harold replied. But it turns out that stress and depression can dramatically affect cancer progression, and removing the sources of both stress and depression can sometimes lead to remarkable recoveries. You're saying the cancer went away because we stopped Robert and Patricia from stealing your money. Harold laughed, a sound I'd heard more often in the past 3 months than in the previous 3 years. I'm saying that when you're not constantly worried about being robbed by your own family members, your body has a much better chance of healing itself. The doctors are calling it a spontaneous remission, but I think it had more to do with finally being able to sleep peacefully again. I set down the medical report and stared at my grandfather. How long have you known about this? I got the test results 2 weeks ago, Harold admitted. I wanted to wait until all the legal proceedings were finished before sharing the news. The legal proceedings had indeed concluded spectacularly. Robert had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for elder abuse and financial fraud. Patricia received 4 years for her role in the conspiracy and forgery scheme. Jake, who had cooperated with prosecutors and shown genuine remorse, received 2 years of probation and was required to perform 500 hours of community service at a local senior center. All of the stolen money had been recovered and returned to Harold's accounts, along with additional penalties and interest that actually left him financially ahead of where he'd been before the theft began. There's something else. Harold continued pulling out another document. I've been working with my attorney to revise my will and estate planning. This document was even more surprising than the medical report. Harold had restructured his entire estate, leaving the bulk of his assets to establish a charitable foundation focused on protecting elderly people from financial abuse. The foundation would provide legal assistance investigation services and advocacy for seniors facing exploitation by family members or caregivers. The Harold Morrison Foundation for Elder Protection. I read aloud. Harold, this is incredible. I want our experience to mean something, Harold explained. Every year, thousands of elderly people are robbed and abused by people they trust. Most of them don't have engineering-minded grandsons willing to investigate financial discrepancies or police detective friends willing to help set up sting operations. But the biggest surprise was in the final paragraph of the document. Harold had named me as the foundation's executive director, with a salary that would allow me to make this work my full-time career. You want me to run a foundation? I asked, overwhelmed by the scope of what Harold was proposing. I want you to use your analytical skills and your sense of justice to help other families avoid what we went through, Harold replied. You have a gift for seeing patterns and building cases. Imagine what you could accomplish with proper resources and legal authority. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. I'd spent the past 3 months learning to investigate financial crimes, document evidence, and work with law enforcement. The thought of applying those skills to help other vulnerable seniors was deeply appealing. What about my engineering career? I asked. What about it? Harold shrugged. You can always go back to engineering if non-profit work doesn't suit you. But Kelvin, you have a rare combination of technical skills, ethical principles, and personal experience that could make you extraordinarily effective in this field. I looked around Harold's kitchen thinking about everything that had changed since that Thanksgiving dinner, when he'd announced his surprising gift. The $500,000 had been just the beginning. Harold had given me something far more valuable, the knowledge that I could stand up to bullies, protect people I cared about, and fight for justice even when the odds seemed impossible. There's one more thing, Harold said, his tone becoming more serious. I need you to understand that while the cancer is gone for now, I'm still 78 years old. I've got good years ahead of me, but not unlimited years. I want to spend whatever time I have left building something positive from what was ultimately a very painful experience. What do you need from me? I asked. I need you to promise me that you'll use what we learned to help other people. Robert and Patricia stole money from me, but they also taught us valuable lessons about how elder abuse happens and how it can be stopped. That knowledge is worth more than anything they took. I reached across the table and grasped Harold's hand, marveling at how strong and steady it still was. I promise. Good, Harold said, his smile returning. Now, let's talk about your first case. I've already been contacted by a woman in Portland whose daughter has been stealing her Social Security checks for 2 years. She heard about our situation through her church, and she wants to know if you might be willing to help her gather evidence. As Harold described the case details, I felt a sense of purpose settling into my chest like a key finding its lock. This was what I was meant to do with my life. Not just engineering structures, but building systems to protect vulnerable people from those who would exploit them. 6 months later, I was carving the turkey at Harold's house, while he told stories to a table full of guests who had become our chosen family. Detective Morris and his wife were there along with Mrs. Thompson from the bank attorney Margaret Sullivan, and 3 seniors I'd helped recover stolen assets from dishonest relatives. It wasn't the same family gathering we'd had a year earlier, but it was infinitely better. These were people who understood the value of integrity, who had chosen to do the right thing even when it was difficult, and who appreciated the gift of being able to trust the people around them. Kelvin, Harold said as I finished slicing the turkey and began serving plates. I want to propose a toast. Everyone raised their glasses, and Harold stood with the dignity and strength that had carried him through decades of building businesses, raising a family, and ultimately fighting for justice when that family betrayed him. To second chances. Harold said, his voice carrying across the room with quiet authority. To the family, we choose the principles we defend, and the courage to stand up for what's right even when the cost seems too high to pay. To second chances, we all echoed, and I felt the warmth of belonging in a way I'd never experienced before. After dinner, as our guests were leaving, and Harold was settling into his favorite chair with a book, I cleaned up the kitchen and reflected on everything that had brought us to this moment. A year ago, I'd been a struggling college graduate working part-time jobs and worrying about student loans. Today, I was the director of a foundation that had already helped recover more than $2 million in stolen assets for elderly victims across 3 states. Harold had given me more than money. He'd given me a mission, a purpose, and the knowledge that one person willing to fight for justice could make a genuine difference in the world. As I turned off the lights and prepared to leave, Harold called out from the living room. Kelvin, thank you for helping an old man fight his battles. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Thank you for teaching me that some battles are worth fighting, I replied. Driving home through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, I thought about the question I'd been asked in dozens of interviews since our story became public. Reporters always wanted to know if I regretted getting involved, if the stress and family destruction had been worth the money Harold had given me. The answer was always the same. The money had been life-changing, but it wasn't the most important gift Harold had given me. What mattered was learning that I could stand up to people who seemed more powerful than me, that I could protect someone I loved from those who wanted to harm them, and that justice was possible even when the system seemed designed to protect the wrong people. Have you ever had to choose between keeping family peace and doing what you knew was right? Sometimes the hardest battles are fought not against strangers, but against the people we thought we could trust. If you've faced a similar situation, or if you know someone who might be experiencing elder abuse, please share this story and let others know that help is available. Remember to like this video if it moved you, subscribe for more stories about standing up for justice, and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's possible to fight back and win. Thank you for letting me share Harold's story and mine. I hope it reminds you that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who stand by you when everything falls apart and help you build something better from the pieces.